Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the promise of the land in Deuteronomy chapter 11 in our continuing study through the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 11:8, where God says, "You shall therefore keep every commandment which I'm commanding you today, so that you may be strong and go in and possess the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, so that you may prolong your days on the land on which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, and to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey." It's been commented that when we describe the land as a land flowing with milk and honey, it's a figure of speech, because flowing with milk, that's not, we think of cow's milk. They would have thought of goat's milk, mountain goats, and so it's a land that has mountains, and yet it's not just mountains, it's also with milk and honey. And honey speaks of bees, and that speaks of the lush fertility of the land. And so it's both mountainous, but it also has lush, fertile areas as well. Verse 10, "For the land into which you are entering to possess it is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden." You go into Egypt and everything is, first of all, Egypt is land along the Nile, not what we think of as Egypt, a lot of desert out there. They just thought of Egypt as land along the Nile. And along the Nile, you just drop something on the ground and you step on the ground and it almost squishes. And there's just water everywhere because the Nile River floods the whole valley, and then when the waters go down, that's when you plant. And Egypt is like that. It never rains in Egypt. They're just waiting for the flooding to take place. By contrast, in verse 11, "But the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, a land of hills and valleys, it drinks water from the rain of heaven." It does rain in the land of Canaan. If it doesn't rain, everything dies. And you have the dry season in the summertime, but in the winter season, that's the rainy season. And it's a land, verse 12, "for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from beginning even to the end of the year, so that he sends the rain. And if he doesn't send the rain, nothing's going to grow, and everything's going to die." Verse 13, "It shall come about, if you listen obediently to my commandments, which I'm commanding you today, to love the Lord your God, and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, that he will give the rain for your land in its season, the early and late rain." Now that doesn't mean you have early rain and then it stops and you have late rain. That means in the rainy season, it begins with the early rains, beginning around October, and then November, by December, and January and February. That's the height of your rainy season. And then the late rain is the tail end of that, March, maybe a little bit in April, and that's the late rain, and then it stops. And at the end of that time, that's when you gather, as we read here, that you may gather in your grain and your new wine and your oil, and that's when you do that. You do that in the springtime, because you're at the beginning now of the summer season where it's not going to rain. Verse 16, "Now he says, beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens, so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land which the Lord has given you." Remember, that is going to happen where Israel turns away from God and they start worshiping false gods and Baal. And in the days of Elijah's going to pray, and it's going to stop raining for a year and 2 years, 3 years, 3.5 years, because remember, half the year is already dry season. And the rains aren't going to come, and everything's going to die, and people are going to be on the edge of perishing. And so there's the warning that's given here. Verse 22, "For if you are careful to keep all this commandment which I am commanding you to do, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and hold fast to him, then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you." The Israelites, there's a lot of them, but they're nothing compared to the Canaanites that are living in the land, because the Canaanites that are living in the land, they have big cities and they have technology and they have warfare, knowledge and experience, and yet God's going to drive them out. He says in verse 24, "Every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours. Your border will be from the wilderness to Lebanon, and from the river Euphrates, as far as the western sea." Now that's much bigger than the confines of little tiny Israel. So your influence is going to be much greater than that. And that actually comes to pass in the days of Solomon. Verse 26, he says, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I'm commanding you today, and the curse if you do not listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I'm commanding you today by following other gods which you have not known." And so he says in verse 29, "It shall come about, when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal." Now, these two mountains, and they're pictured here on our slide, between them lies this little tiny city, the ancient city of Shechem. By the time you get to the New Testament era, it's not called Shechem anymore. The name has been sort of Hellenized. It's been, the Greek form of the name. Instead of calling it Shechem, they call it Sychar. And this is the place to which Jesus comes and speaks to a Samaritan woman. And it's striking that they're to go to the Israelites when they come into the land. They're to go and they're going to place a blessing on Mount Gerizim and a curse on Mount Ebal. And the question is, what are you going to choose? What mountain are you going to choose? To which mountain will you go? Where will you live? Are you going to live in a way that calls for the blessing or which calls for the cursing? And you remember the story of the Samaritans is that they had become something of a cursed people. And yet Jesus comes here and he turns the cursing into blessing, because he presents himself first to an outcast Samaritan woman, and eventually to the whole town, and they come and they hear him and they believe and they choose the blessing. And here's the question: are you going to do that too? You see, Jesus became a curse for you. He went to the Mount of Cursing. He was hung upon a cross, bearing the sins of the world, taking upon himself your curse, so that by trusting in him, you can come to the place of blessing. Will you do it?